Hello again, welcome back. Now for our next keynote here. We're joined by Kelvin Brewer, Director, US Public Sector Sales Engineering at Ping Identity. We're talking friend or fraud, why identity matters in user experience. Welcome, Kelvin, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Really good, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. If you do have questions for Kelvin during his presentation, just pop them in the chat, which are on that side of me, or down that side of your screen. Pop them in there and we'll come to any questions at the end. The virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you, appreciate it. So today, as was explained, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the user experience and how we can make the experience for the user better while still reducing fraud. And I'll point out where some artificial intelligence, machine learning are becoming more and more important in this area and where we're implementing those. And look forward to your questions. So just to start out, let's talk about why, what's happening in the fraud space, right? With fraud right now with businesses and government. So most of the time, businesses and government have a line item for anticipated fraud losses. Of course, that's profits, that's tax dollars, but the goal is just to stay under that number. Often that comes out to be around 5% of revenue for commercial companies that are frontline customer-facing companies. But the threat landscape's always evolving. Things are changing, fraud threats are getting more sophisticated and hard to stop. Fraud costs were over $12 billion in the United States alone in the last government-issued report. Account takeover attempts are up 354% year over year. That's huge. And social engineering attacks are up 400%. A single dollar of fraud costs between $3.5 and $4.5 US to fully resolve, depending on the industry. Over 3/4 of security, IT, and business decision makers say that they consider identity fraud as the number one priority when it comes to fraud prevention. Fraud prevention is now a conversation about identities. So what's interesting about that is that Ping Identity, and we'll be talking a little bit about overall solutions in the market and where Ping fits in, but Ping is uniquely positioned to help customers reduce fraud and still keep the user experience, something that facilitates more business, more revenue, more improvement on the use of tax dollars. And the market around various identity risk and fraud tools is consolidating. So you're seeing a lot of companies doing acquisitions and things and bringing together technologies that include things like identity services, fraud reduction services, identity proofing services. It's all coming together and becoming a more agile offering to help respond to these evolving threats over time. So what is identity fraud? Let's start out by defining the term. So identity fraud centers around the identities of your users or people close to them. Your identity and access management infrastructure is therefore the entrance point to business resources and customer data and finances. It is the digital front door. So when identity fraud's happening, it can mean taking over a legitimate user's identity to take over their account. So usually first it's the identity that gets taken over so that they can take over the account. It can also mean creating a synthetic identity using a mix of stolen or fake identity data to synthesize a believable new identity. And then that fraudster then takes that to apply for credit, apply for new loans, apply for new accounts, make use of stolen payment information, so on and so on. And adjacent to identity theft is another identity crime that we're going to be talking about. That's the act of pretending to be someone else in order to perpetuate a financial scam via social engineering. All of these crimes start with a compromised identity. The financial loss comes later down the line, and we'll talk through that in just a minute. But stopping the identity crime is where you're going to then cut the financial losses that could have occurred later. So how does this happen? How does this crime begin? The transaction, the fraudulent purchase, that's really the last step in the process for the criminal. They've gone through a whole bunch of other steps before they actually get to the point where they're able to steal money or commit fraud. And so the legacy fraud prevention focuses on the point of the money transaction, and that transaction fraud monitoring, it looks at whether or not the purchase or transfer seems to be legitimate. But this is a bad idea for several reasons. Chief among them is the fact that it means you're missing a whole lot of context. A lot can happen before the transaction. And in fact, we're even going to talk about several prevalent types of fraud that don't feature a transaction, either not at all, or at least not for a while. Focusing here also doesn't do any good for your user experience. Late detection means fewer choices for mitigation and extra friction at the point of transaction, which is a key cause for session abandonment. So a lot of times the user registration, the user authentication process is seamless. And then you get to the transaction, and that's where all of the fraud prevention focuses on making that have a lot of checks involved, and that slows down the user experience. And then you get a lot of session abandonment for legitimate transactions. So let's discuss what it means when I say a fraudster has to commit an identity crime first. Here are some use cases we see often within our user community. Let's start out with account takeover. Account takeovers can be caught at login. The criminal takes over an account in good standing to use the card on file to make an order or to transfer money from a bank account into their own bank account. The criminal uses stolen payment info from some other source, takes over an existing account, changes out the payment info, makes the order with the stolen card, then changes everything back, and then disappears. They take over an account to gain access to a limited edition item only offered to top customers, say those with a certain number of loyalty points. And then another thing that they'll do is maybe they're not actually here to even transact anything at all. They may just want to get into the account to harvest data, including PII and payment information, in order to use it in other crimes in other places. Another type of crime is new account fraud. This can be caught at registration. Organization are offering a sign-up bonus to a first-time customer or a referral bonus to users who refer new customers. New accounts are created to exploit those offers. Getting around a one per customer restriction on a certain item, the fraudsters realized that through previous attempts that you scrutinize new accounts or guests much more intensely, so they want to let a new account age a bit before they commit the crime. So they'll make this new account and then they'll wait a while before they actually do something. And then the other one is they use a stolen or synthetic identity to open a new line of credit or even apply for a loan or something of that nature. So then there's even a few more. There's scam examples. So this is usually going to be financial services specific, where the fraudster can be caught at or just before the transaction stage. But the actual transaction is going to be hard to detect. The user is accessing their own account. A fraudster reaches out to your legitimate customer and convinces them to transfer money, like a romance scam or a grandparent scam, for example. And I've had my own in-laws and parents fall to these kind of scams where they get that phone call where people try and get them to send money through their bank account or through PayPal or those kind of things. And the last but not least, bots. And bots are dangerous because 47.4% of internet traffic comes from bots, and a lot of them have bad intentions. They can be caught from the moment they first interact with your site. They commit fraud quickly and at scale, and it often involves more than one bot. So it's a lot of bots attacking at once. And typical crimes include testing stolen credit cards, password cracking, inventory hoarding for scalping, sniping goods by monitoring time-based events such as, and also automated attacks like those. These can cost 4.3% of online revenues, which is up 72% from last year. So bot attacks are becoming much more and more lucrative for criminals. And most organizations, around 88%, say that bots have negatively impacted the satisfaction of legitimate customers, which is a big concern because those bots are attacking, slowing down systems, making it so that the users will then abandon their transactions because of the experience. So this is why it's important to shift left on fraud, because all of these things happen before they start happening, before the transaction actually occurs. These identity crimes proceed way before that financial loss, like I was saying, and starting the fraud monitoring and response earlier is imperative for 4 key reasons. One is monitoring users throughout the entire session provides more context, allowing for better detection accuracy. They also, by starting that fraud prevention early, you can help prevent fraudulent activities that don't involve a transaction, such as a referral abuse, bonus abuse, and data scraping. Identifying and challenging fraudsters earlier means you can shut down their schemes before the loss actually occurs, leading to a significant savings in fraud resolution costs from, lowering down from that $3.50 to $4.50, lowering that cost down significantly. And finally, getting a better detection accuracy and mitigation and mitigating fraud earlier in the session allows for less friction for the valid users at the point of transaction, which can help boost satisfaction and decrease abandonment, which we've seen abandonment levels of, 1 out of 3 customers, a lot of times, sometimes even 2 out of 3 that I've seen from them just finding too much friction in the process. We're used to thinking about fraud prevention like this. It's a balancing act. High security usually means high friction. High friction is a deterrent to your end customers, so organizations strive to strike a balance, but it doesn't have to be a balancing act. Actually, doing fraud prevention right and shifting left on fraud can mean a better experience for legitimate users. When you deploy early, flexible, and targeted mitigation, your real customers see less friction, and you can offer them more trust, translating to better experiences. Meanwhile, you're still protected from bad actors with higher confidence than ever. Let's talk about how to make that happen. So when you're looking at a robust threat response, you have to understand how and why the threat actors are attacking you, and then you need to build out a dynamic response that changes based on the risk of each individual user. Every user that enters your digital property is either a genuine user or a threat actor. Those are your two. And the threat actors are coming in with the intention of committing fraud or acting via some kind of an attack vector. Those users then enter your configured account journey, performing actions like registering for an account, logging in, and then transacting some sort of business. As they move through the journey, you look at the risk signals. This is the optimal situation. You're looking at those risk signals from multiple sources. And this is where artificial intelligence and machine learning are vital, because they help identify those risk signals. It's basically user event behavior analytics, right? And then as you find those risk signals and they reach certain thresholds, then you employ various detection techniques to look at things like bot detection, suspicious device, velocities, things like that. And then based on that, you classify things. You put them at different threat indicators. You list the risk associated with those detected techniques. And then you make a decision on what to do about it. That decision can be all sorts of different steps. If there's no risk or the risk is acceptable, then you can continue to provide a frictionless experience for the user. Otherwise, you can do some mitigation that can include up to blocking accounts or enforcing MFA or doing CAPTCHA or requiring more ID proofing or reducing their access depending on the type of risk that you found. And as you do that, that information, what you gather as you mitigate feeds back to your fraud system to constantly improve your detection accuracy. So it's vital for you to have that feeding back into your risk identification system to tell you better to make better decisions going forward. And then you monitor, log, generate reports, and then you're able to tune accordingly. And sometimes that means changing your decision matrix, the orchestration process of what you're doing once risk has been identified. So here we're going to talk a little bit more about the ping formula for preventing fraud. the first step, of course, in that is to do preventative measures. And preventative measures are the baseline security measures you put in place that aren't dependent on live risk scoring. For example, you may force ID proofing when the user's registering or when they're applying for something new, like a line of credit. Or you may force other types of friction, like MFA, based on whatever the rules are. The friction by default can be tricky, so you need to be careful not to overdo friction. But in some situations, and in certain verticals like financial, for example, or healthcare, it can be a good practice to put in things like MFA. And then you've got the detection, which is where you have a lot of the AIML coming out, where we're doing a lot of work with that. And that is to do that real-time threat detection during the process, whether it's during registration or during an authentication attempt, looking and doing risk scoring and enforcing decisions. The last step being your response. That's a key component in determining how you're going to respond to fraud that's been detected. And that really it's really important here to have an orchestration engine that gives you the flexibility of determining how you're going to handle things for your unique organization, government, or company. You've got to decide what's appropriate for you once you've recognized a potential fraud to react, and what the right steps to take are that meet your policies as an organization. And then, the other one is new account fraud, and the response can be different for this. And, there's when you've got new account fraud, a lot of times it's important to put in more steps for identity assurance to enforce MFA. MFA saved me from hacking attempts, fraud attempts many times where I've gotten a notification that someone else is trying to log in. I go in and I change up my password. I check to make sure the MFA wasn't compromised. And that's the thing that is so important in this, is just making sure that you're able to defend, when accounts are created, you're able to, the users themselves can go and defend their accounts if they're valid, and if they're not valid, if they're new accounts that were created in their name or something, they can identify that and have the sessions killed, have the account deleted, whatever it may be. That's part of that response for those. When you've got account takeover, the response is going to be different. It's similar in some ways, but it's different in others, because it's a valid user in every respect, but it's a bad actor who's using it. And so in this case, you're going to want to do, at the point of authentication, you want to recognize that those things are happening and enforce whatever steps you need to. And this is where you've got a lot of reliance on MFA and dynamic response, things like what time it is of the day, the context, the geolocation, things like that. And scams, of course, are a little different, because this is where social engineering comes in. It's all about identifying risky transactions in real time. The account isn't necessarily compromised. The customer is the one who's compromised, the individual, the person. And that's a unique situation where it's you identifying that their transaction is not normal, and then determining a reaction based on that to block the scammer. Now, this is where we think the future is going. So just the last thing I wanted to touch on is that, the future is verifiable credentials. And there's a lot of reasons why. We've been working a lot with different states who are doing mobile driver's license that are basically verified credentials that they want to start using for allowing citizens to log into state services. You've got companies looking at this as a way to streamline the process of accepting a digital credential that's been verified properly. But the important thing is that digital credentials can deliver identification, authentication, and authorization because of their flexibility. But it's all about how they've been proofed, what is associated with it, what kind of extended attributes are detailed on the credential, and it's something that the user owns, and so it's been verified somehow. And like an MDL with a state has been verified through the state. The person it's been proven that it's them. They've done usually a liveness check on a selfie compared to their state ID picture. It's created a digital account that can then be used, and additional proofing details can be stored with the identity to verify that they've been proofed and vetted to meet whatever criteria is needed to allow them access into an environment. It's still a challenge, though, to transition from a physical ID to a digital ID. So here at Ping Identity, we see this as an ongoing challenge for people. Typically, a central authority would need to issue a physical ID, like the state's issuing a driver's license, right? After a verification process. Physical IDs by default, they're authoritative, they're verifiable, they're trustworthy. And an in-person comparison of the picture on the ID and things like that is what we've used for a long time. This physical user, let's say he's got he decides with that physical identity when to share it, whether it's with a healthcare, a bank, a restaurant, those kind of things. The importance of privacy is is defined by the user who owns the physical ID. A digital identity today typically exists locally within the business and the entities that we interact with every day. This model reverses how we leverage our physical IDs. These businesses and entities are their own central authority and possess the necessary information, sometimes more than they need to know about the users that sign up for their services. As their own central authority, they also have the capability through federation to simplify the sign-on process by sending user information around. And, as you can see with this one, the physical IDs versus the digital ID gives a lot more information to the central authority, the organizations. So a digital credential is used in many different cases. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to touch on too much of this, but every single one of these verticals has different use cases where digital credentials would give them an advantage and reduce fraud. The real pattern is first, you've got the registration process, issuing a credential, where the user goes through a process to give them a credential that usually involves in-depth identity proofing and then verification and collection of attributes, and then finally doing a signed credential that they can use. And then taking that credential that's been associated with a wallet, tied to a wallet, they then can take that and use it to authenticate into approved services. And that is where we're going to be able to reduce fraud, because that digital identity is associated with an individual and they have to prove their identity every time they want to use it, whether it's facial ID on their phones, which is most of the time what's happening. And then they can scan it almost like a tap for pay. It's kind of a tap for ID kind of a motion that they can use to prove their identity. All right, just some key takeaways before we go to questions. Identity fraud, it's the highest priority for security, for user experience, professionals alike. There's no one technology or strategy to address identity fraud, but doing it at the beginning of the process, the beginning of the identity process, where they're going through and at the point of authentication, at the point of registration, is going to reduce the financial fraud later. And then also, some things that are helping now is having an in-depth orchestration tool that allows you to integrate with adaptive risk analysis, with identity verification, and verifiable credentials as we move on in the identity space. I'd like to thank you for your time today. And do we have any questions?
Kelvin, thank you very much indeed. We are right up on time, so I'm just going to come to you with one quick question if I can. And I guess it's an overarching question for you about the biggest misconception or myth you see when it comes to identity fraud. What would that be? Is it a technological thing? Is it a people thing? What would that be?
That's a great question. I think the biggest misconception is that technology, when implemented correctly, can't address most of the problems. I think that's a misconception. I think the technology's there. I think that people, by and large, the majority of people interacting with companies, with government, have good intentions, and they're honestly trying to leverage services. And the few bad actors that we have out there are messing it up for everybody. But there's patterns. There's now solutions out there that are advanced and can detect those bad behaviors quickly. And I think, the investment, the level of investment it takes to get a return on investment when implementing these kind of solutions is reducing, the level of effort's reducing to do the implementation as well as to get the return on investment. And so, it used to be that identity projects, identity solutions took a long time to get that ROI, but I think that's dropped dramatically because of things like AIML, things like the way that UIs have advanced and orchestration specifically. So I think it's technology has caught up to the point where we're able to really address this in a way that's going to reduce fraud.
Well, I wish we could talk longer. I would have plenty more questions for you, Kelvin, but we are right up on time. So I'd like to thank you for joining us here at Tech and AI Live New York.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.